Welcome to the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we're here in Crestone, Colorado, visiting with a couple of very special friends, John Milton, the founder of The Way of Nature, and one of our Why on Earth community ambassadors, Bud Wilson. John, Bud, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Great to be here.
Really excited for our conversation today and to have the opportunity, John, to dive deep into your career, your work, your impact, and of course so much of that has been in collaboration with Bud, and we've got a lot to talk about today.
Great.
John P. Milton is a pioneering ecologist, spiritual teacher, meditation master, vision quest leader, and shaman. John's vision quest and shamanic work began in the mid-1940s after experiencing his first vision quest at the age of 7. Since the 1950s, John has guided thousands of people into the wilderness, sharing with them experiences and practices that cultivate a deep connection with nature and, ultimately, source awareness. Over the years, many have sought his profound transmissions and powerful yet gentle Qigong teachings. Tai Chi training, meditation practices, internal alchemy training, shamanic processes, and sacred passage programs. John continues to live, explore, and lead wilderness trainings in many of the Earth's wild and sacred places. Through Way of Nature, he offers nature quests, sacred passages, advanced awareness trainings, as well as custom programs and retreats for both individuals and groups. We've got several books that John's written or co-authored that we'll reference as well, and of course we'll be listing a lot of that in the show notes. But let me just ask by first inquiring, John, given your background and your experience, which, as we'll talk about a little later, includes work with the White House, why nature? What's the big deal? Why does that even matter? Why does wilderness even matter to us as humans?
Well, it's interesting. Thoreau had a statement from his time in in solitude in nature at the famous Walden Pond. And he made a statement once, in wildness is the preservation of the world. And what he meant by that is that in that solitude and the depth of connection to all of nature, and to, when we say nature in the way of nature, we mean outer nature and the whole family of living things, the ecosystems, and the broader global environment and Mother Gaia, Mother Earth. And also inner nature, the whole dance of emotions, thoughts, the play of sight and sound and touch and smell, movement and balance, and the comprehension of energy flowing through us. We call those the 9 experiential fields. So that comprises the dance of how our inner nature begins to display. And then true nature is the source level of being, that ground of being that almost all the great spiritual traditions refer to as the basis for all experience of life, the dance of life itself. So in order to come into back in, one of the biggest challenges of modern times is coming back into balance, and harmony and good relationship with the big family. We talk a lot about the big family of all living things. The indigenous peoples always talk about all our relations. Same thing. So we encourage coming back into an experience of direct connection and communion with that big family of all living things, all beings. And through that receive some of the wisdom of how to behave and function in a way that is part of, a harmonious part of that system. It guides our technology. It guides things like AI. It can guide many of the facets of modern life that if we do not do that, we fall out of harmony. We come back into these massive problems like climate change, the sixth extinction, and the elimination of much of life. Many of the catastrophes of environmental pollution, like the plasticization of the planet and the birth of all these, everything from Roundup appearing in much of our food systems, poisoning the soil with these nicotinamide types of poisons that kill every living thing in the soil.
Yeah.
Complete opposite of the indigenous way of viewing the earth. And the way of nature believes that the soil and the water are two very fundamental parts of natural systems. So how do we come back into harmony? Well, to come back into harmony, we have to come back into right relationship. To come back into right relationship, you have to have good communication between yourself and the rest of life. How do you accomplish that in a life in cities and disconnected in urban centers? You do that by setting some time aside on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis to go deep into reconnection and re-immersion in the big family of all living things and drop human culture for a while.
Yeah.
So you're empty and open and spacious. You can receive and listen.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So I have to ask a sort of facetious or tongue-in-cheek question, although at the heart of this question is something I'd really love to hear you speak to. When I lived in New York City, that's where I first went to university, moving from the Rocky Mountain West, where my pals and I were often backpacking in wilderness and spending a lot of time in nature, being smack in the middle of Manhattan for weeks, a few days at a time is great, but for weeks, created in me a palpable, visceral experience of what now professionals are referring to as nature deficit disorder, which I'm grateful for the experience. But I'm wondering, with folks, so many of us are living urban lifestyles and are so caught up, we could say, in a variety of, we might say distractions, but maybe to be a bit more generous, a variety of places that we're focusing our attention, things we're thinking about, things we're concerned about. And a whole lot of that, it seems to me, in particularly the big urban settings, is not necessarily very connected to nature. And moreover, often when we're suffering from nature deficit disorder, it seems we're not even necessarily aware that that's a condition we might be suffering from. And so I'm curious, when you have the opportunity to speak with folks who maybe aren't yet tuned into the fact that there's this whole other aspect to the human experience, how do you go about discussing that with them?
Well, one of the first things I often ask people is what brings them joy and happiness in life. And very often, I lived in my first apartment in New York was in West 11th Street, across from St. Vincent Hospital in the West Village. And later I was in the upper West Side in Spanish Harlem. Used to take my dates to the Apollo. And this was in the kind of in the mid-60s period.
Very cool. Good time to be there.
Dylan was playing, and Joan Baez.
I was at Washington Square, like 8th and University. Got to get to Chick Corea at the Blue Note. That was cool. But
absolutely cool. My dad knew Count Basie, was a friend of his, and we used to go in and visit Count Basie and go to the Blue Note. And he would sometimes be invited to come up and drum with Count Basie.
Cool.
So I grew up with a lot of New York influence. And I think the city has a lot to offer.
Yeah.
It does have that perspective that the New Yorker had a famous poster where there's Manhattan Island, and then you can see kind of a landscape out there that's sort of flat. And then in the distance on the horizon is a little steeple coming up, which was the Transamerica building, I think, in San Francisco. And that was the New Yorker's view of America. Yeah. There's something to it. So I ended up in that, my first job brought me to New York because we were based on I think it was 40th Street. near Grand Central Station. And so I had these different apartments to live in, and I had a deep immersion building on what I experienced as a kid. And what I discovered is that you could live in a little apartment, and if you had one tree, I had an ailanthus tree in one of my little backyards, tree of heaven it's called, from China, and one little ailanthus tree, which is considered a weed tree in many places. But you could sit with that weed tree and begin to embrace and connect to the life force of that tree, to the beauty of that tree. If you listen deeply, you could begin to hear something of what that tree had to offer you. If you could enter into a state of inner stillness and silence in space, if there's any openness to listen. And then you could begin to establish a kind of natural communion with even a so-called weed tree in a tiny backyard on 11th Street in New York City. And then the butterflies would come in and dance with the tree. And nature would show up. It may be highly modified and simplified. It's still there. Our bodies are nature. We have these amazing energy flows through our system. We have all kinds of capacities to energetically connect. We have these beautiful gifts of being able to see and to hear and to touch. And those are vehicles for connectivity. If we begin to connect with a tree, maybe go out to Central Park, spend a little time in a quiet part of the park. And you can always find a quiet space.
Yeah.
And start connecting with a beautiful tree, or maybe the elements, the soil, the earth, the water, the sky and the air, the spaciousness that contains all of these elements of nature. And in the Chinese system, you have the earth element providing a foundation for the stone element, or metal element, providing a foundation for the water element, providing a foundation for the wood element, trees grow out of soil, and then finally, and water, and then the wood element provides the foundation for the fire element. In the Tibetan and Ayurvedic systems, the fire element continues on to support the air element, and then you have the air element supporting the opening of the space element. So if you work with those 7 elements to connect more deeply through the body and through the gift of these 9 fields of experience that we all have, then even in the middle of Manhattan, you can have a deep and profound experience with the fundamental essence of life itself and the planetary connection that we all have.
Sure. That resonates for me. I've experienced that directly. I'm also curious, though, do you think there's a qualitatively different kind of experience we can have while we're in wilderness?
Yes, in fact, because of my age, I was born in 1938, and I was able to actually run an expedition. I did many expeditions as a young man between 15, 16, and 30. I would find a blank spot on the map that said unknown territory, or tierra incognita, no history of modern humans going into that place. Now, of course, indigenous peoples had inhabited most of the planet, but in terms of modern humans, there were still a few places left where modern humans had not been. So I'd find those places in places like the Brooks Range of northern Alaska or the Mackenzie Mountains of northern Canada. And then I would find a few people crazy enough to go in with me. I'd go in for up to 3 or 4 months at a time and just immerse myself in the wildness. A kind of wildness is there because no human culture other than the early indigenous peoples had been able to be there. So they were wild because of their remoteness, or their difficulty to get there. And there was a quality in that wildness that you do not find in the rest of preserved wilderness. Once you draw that boundary to protect it, the quality of that space begins to shift. And you begin to have these, one of my friends from many years ago used to call them contemporary concentration camps for nature.
Oh, interesting.
And it's kind of a weird thought, but the idea there was that we'd reached a point where human culture was so dominant that in order to allow nature to be itself without human primary influence, we need to have places where nature could be free to unfold in its own natural way. We call those wildness places. Now, of course, wildness means wild deerness. So originally especially from places like Ireland and Scotland, this concept of wild deerness became a concept of wild places where nature could unfold in an untrammeled fashion. And I've been a major proponent of preserving wilderness areas and wild places in modern times because it is necessary. And there's a big difference between going to a national park where you get a ton of people going through and going into a space where you're one of the few people maybe that walks through that in any given year. And you're surrounded by a family of living things that have a little bit of relationship to humans, but not a lot. They're living a very free life. There's something very special that happens when you enter that kind of system and become one of it. And you begin to discover that we have our own potential to rewild ourselves. And to rediscover the inherent capacity to re-indigenize ourselves. So we live as part of the natural system in the way the ancient peoples did. Part of my ancestral history goes back to the Mohawk people. And and some of the other eastern tribes. Those elements in our bloodlines give us a little bit of the genetic memory that's carried in the DNA that probably are part of the epigenetic system too. And they reinvigorate us with that knowledge that there's something very magical and very deep when you tap into these ancient ways of being with nature. And a certain kind of wisdom can come forth, which we believe in the way of nature provides exactly the kind of wisdom we need to bring forth a kind of technology and a way of living as humans in modern times that's in balance with the planet, with Mother Gaia. So very important to reconnect with that wildness. And celebrate it.
Beautiful. I love what you're speaking to with the epigenetics and the imprinting. And one of the things I've experienced and explored and written about is that we all have the genetic imprints of indigenous lifeways in us by definition of being human on the planet. And I'm so struck by the ways in which these imprints on you have allowed you to put your fingerprints on a whole lot of what we're experiencing in our world, and especially here in the United States with some of the environmental protection policies that you were instrumental in having under the Nixon administration and so
and
forth.
Before too.
We're gonna get into that, but you also mentioned something about these experiences you've had all around the world, and I know, Bud, you have been with John on a bunch of these amazing adventures. You've shared some stories with me, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Bud, for making this connection and making this special conversation happen today. And you and I have been having so much fun with the Y on Earth Community Ambassador Network and our work with the Luciel community throughout the world, and our gathering in Barcelona last fall. So yeah, just a shout out of gratitude to you, Bud. And I was hoping you could share with us from your perspective, through your eyes, what some of these experiences and adventures have looked like and felt like and been.
Well, let's see, how much time do we have? So, yes, thank you for acknowledging all of that, and thank you for all of your extraordinary efforts with Y on Earth. And as John often refers to me as his senior student, so I figured today, here I'm sitting as Exhibit A of John's commitment and dedication to really activating within each of us what you were just speaking of, whether it goes back to Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. We all have some of that trace elements within us. And I think what John's capacity is to work with each of us as individuals to really rewild what we know is within us. And yet it's been covered over by the frantic pace of our modern culture. So sometimes I like to refer to a teaching that John gave us about separating from our identity initially as part of the process. And one of the ways that happens is by pushing the pause button on the prison of our self-importance.
Nice.
And that's a phrase that I've often used with people because when I first started, I went down to the Baja, where John has had a lot of his work in the Baja Peninsula, Mexico. And when I got back to where I was living at the time, Snowmass Village in the mountains of Colorado, people would say, "What in the world did you go down there to hang out with John Milton for 6 nights and 7 days of alone time on the Pacific Ocean in a solo site with no disruption from any human beings?" And I would say, well, what I can tell you is there is a lot more going on in every nanosecond than our Western rational, analytical, reductionist conditioning has ever even thought of allowing us to experience. And during that very first sacred passage that I took with John as our teacher and guide, the earth actually literally breathed me. Instead of the other way around. And what I think one of the most profound teachings and lessons that I've come to appreciate from John is surrendering to the magic and the mystery, because it goes so far beyond everything that we are taught from the time we're little kids in kindergarten as a separation approach and building up your identity. And so I think then, after much of our world travels together, where we traveled into Nepal and Thailand and Indonesia, and that was just preparation to come back into the United States. And he asked me to guide some of his senior students in the Baja on my way back before I went up into the Cochise stronghold of the desert mountains of Arizona for a 40-day solo. And I was on quite a ride, I can tell you, from my background and being conditioned, so in this Western mentality. And it really opened up a pathway of being able to surrender to what is, and a couple of the principles that John really emphasizes early on in the process of learning how to tap into our deepest true nature is relaxation combined with presence, and the present moment, and being able to be free of all of our thoughts of the past, projections of the future, that usually elevates a sense of either fear or trepidation, or regret and sadness and despair. So you can cut through all of that through the process that John offers through the Way of Nature teachings. And as I said, I can go on and on about that sort of value of pushing the pause button on our self-important engagement with all the, bells and whistles and bright and shiny objects that are constantly trying to get our attention and just distract us from what really, really matters. And one of the things that John was saying, when you were saying, well, how do you tell somebody in a major, dense human population city that there's something that nature has something to offer? One of the real keys as well is, John alluded to the taker mentality. You go into nature, what's it going to give me today? What can I take away with me? Instead, if you go in, and just as another part of the core teachings, with an open heart and actually with your intention, give back your love and appreciation and gratitude,
Yeah.
to all that is,
Yeah.
nature shows up in a profoundly different manner than what we're accustomed to. By just that level, and it's easily accomplished with conscious, mindful awareness.
Mm.
So John often talks about these advanced awareness trainings. Well, it is. It's about shifting your awareness so that you can become fully present.
Mm. Mm.
And there are lots of other stories that we could share that are, that open up the pathway to the mystery,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm more than happy to share at some point.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful. Thank you, bud. Yeah, it reminds me of one of my favorite little takeaways from Nietzsche's work, the gift-giving virtue. As we enter into relationship in any manner or capacity to go into it with the spirit of giving gift, opens up so much for us to receive, right? There's a reciprocity that emerges out of that dynamic that's beautiful. And man, we could go in so many directions right now. I'm gonna
Well,
wind my reel a little here.
let me just add one more part of this.
I love you, bud, because you always
John-
have more to add.
John, as you know, spoke to this trajectory from Thoreau,
Yeah.
right? And so each era seems to have had a spokesperson for
Mm.
the core essential need for human beings to come back into
Mm.
balance in nature and with nature and in harmony. So John really in this era is carrying on that lineage from
Mhm.
Thoreau to Muir,
Mm-hmm.
Rachel Carson. And John has chosen to be under the radar to a certain extent because he kind of merges between walking in the halls of the powerful elite in Washington, D.C. as a activist for policy making and all of that level of our culture and our society. And then he also has gone deeper into being a sage of wisdom for nature,
Mm-hmm.
with the capacity to really synthesize all of these teachings from the great environmentally oriented activists and the spiritual components that all of our great wisdom teachers and wisdom traditions have offered. And so he fulfills that role of synthesizing and bringing all of that into an easily accessible formula
Mm-hmm.
that appeals to modern humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's carrying on that lineage, and it's so critically important in this stage of our
Mm-hmm.
emergence as a species if we want humanity to get through this gauntlet of all the meta crises that we're
Mhm.
facing.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. And I want to mention for our audience that there are many ways that each of us can connect in with this work you're doing, John, and the variety of resources you've made available, including there's opportunities for folks to come here to this part of our world in Crestone, Colorado, with the Way of Nature Foundation's Sacred Land Sanctuary, 300 acres of very special land just up the road from where we are currently, to many books, and I've got one of them right here that I've been enjoying, spending some time with, Sky Above, Earth Below, that I'm showing for folks who are tuning in to the video portion of our discussion. And then you just gifted me, before our taping today, this beautiful collection of leaves, of cards we can take with us into the wilderness, cultivating natural liberation. And I noticed going through your body of work, you've got some really wonderful ways of organizing how we might approach these opportunities and imperatives, we might even say, like the 12 principles of natural liberation and the 6 empowerments. And I would love to spend some time hearing from you, talking us through some of what's available to us. Before getting there, I also want to ask you a question that's kind of burning for me. how has it been for you to cultivate the balance needed as you're bridging worlds, one could say, when working in the halls of power in Washington, D.C., for example? And I'd love for you to tell us a bit about the work you did back around the time of the Nixon administration. There are very strong forces at work of fear and separation and greed and power dynamics, right? That in many respects are the archetypal antitheses to this whole other way of being in peaceful, reciprocal relationship as described in the original instructions and so forth. And I'm wondering, would you reflect for us on your time in DC and your experience of how you were navigating that day in and day out relative to all of this other wisdom and knowledge you have direct experience with?
Well, I feel very fortunate that I was brought into DC. I actually started in New York, which is part of what got me into the Village and the Apollo Theater, places like that. But that was the early 60s. Then the head of the foundation was taken over by a man named Russell Train, who was originally from D.C. And he was a tax court judge originally. And he brought the Conservation Foundation that I worked for, which later merged with the World Wildlife Fund, became kind of the brain trust for World Wildlife Fund. It became one organization. But in those days it was separate, called the Conservation Foundation. And we were looking for kind of cutting edge ways we could invest and bring grants into things that would help to move the culture into a more balanced and harmonious way of living with nature. And of course there had been a lot of work done on natural resources conservation. And there were some real pioneers like Fairfield Osborne. These days probably very few people have heard that name. He was the head of the Bronx Zoo. And he wrote a book published, I think it was in 1948, called Our Plundered Planet. And that book became kind of a guideline for those of us at the foundation that were trying to figure out ways to become more skillful in what I mentioned. And another hero or heroine for us was Rachel Carson, who brought into our understanding not only was the earth being plundered, but it was being poisoned. And she brought in very clearly the effect of all kinds of what happens when these pesticides and herbicides enter the environment and cycle through the natural ecosystems of the planet. And of course it harms us as humans as part of that system, and it has massively dangerous effects on all of life. For example, in those days, the bald eagle almost went extinct, our national bird, through the thinning of the shells of the bald eagle through DDT poisoning. And it almost caused the eagle to become extinct. Fortunately, we got a ban affected on the use of DDT in such a widespread, chaotic fashion, and that led to the recovery of the bald eagle. It's a really wonderful success story. We need a few success stories, I think. And that's one of them. So anyway, but in those days, the whole relationship was based on what I call a taker mentality. What can we get from nature that we want? So it was not really, there's no sense of being in a partnership relation, much less in a family relationship. So what I noticed from my time with the indigenous peoples, because I was already studying, I spent a year with a Mayan shaman in the Lacandon tribe. And one of the lessons I got from that was how naturally and completely the tribe lived in absolute harmony with the rest of the play of life. And yes, people got food. We used to go out and hunt wild turkey and even monkeys. There's nothing quite like seeing a monkey in a big bowl with an arm lifting out like a baby. It's a bit scary. But what I learned from that time was that these people lived in such a way that they never overtook anything from the forest. They gathered, they hunted and gathered from the forest. The amount of time they spent, and this is true for most indigenous cultures, it takes about, what would you say how long it takes to maintain a lifestyle in a indigenous culture living in the ancient natural way?
Yeah, the number I remember hearing is 4 hours.
2 to 4, 2 to 3.
Yeah.
2 to 3. So 2 to 3 hours were spent in what you needed to take care of the garden, to hunt a bit of gathering in the rainforest, do a bit of hunting to get a bit of meat for your table. And the rest of the day, the other 22 hours, are devoted to the arts, to ceremony, to spiritual practice and cultivation, to lovemaking, to enjoying the dance of life, and displaying a kind of basic creativity that is part of the great gift of being in these bodies in these lifetimes. And they had the time for it. How many hours do you think folks spend today making a living?
Making a living or making money, or what are we talking about here?
Making money to make a living.
Yeah, way too many, probably.
What would you guess? How many out of the average day? How much is devoted to?
For general Western advanced culture, we're saying. I don't know. What is it? 9, 10 hours.
Well, it's probably, if you take together the work time and then the time to care of the bookkeeping, the tax paying, the keeping up with the car, the house, and so on, which adds in it easily another average 4 hours a day at least. So you've got the 8-hour workday to and from 10 hours maybe, another 4 to 6 hours maybe involved in
most all of the waking
in family
hours.
Obligations, your kids, everything you could do, be a good father or mother.
Yeah.
It gets up around probably 16 to 18 hours a day.
Yeah.
You're left with how many hours?
Not too many.
Maybe 4 to 6.
Yeah.
On the average. Compared to, so there you've got a system, 16 hours a day to kind of keep going in your modern context versus 2 hours.
Yeah.
And everything else was open and available for creative, joyful experience of life.
Yeah.
I would say that if you look at it from that perspective, we've kind of devolved.
Right.
And we lost that natural indigenous capacity to live in harmony and let nature take care of everything. We shifted from nature taking care of everything, which gave us a huge amount of time to enjoy life, to let's control everything, let's manage everything. Well, you try to manage everything, you go nuts. We do not have the wisdom and the knowledge to be able to do that. Look at climate change. We only have a tiny understanding of what's happening to the global environment. We can see massive hurricanes appearing, massive cyclones, huge tornado systems that are unlike anything we've had before historically. Temperatures in the ocean increasing massively, air temperatures increasing massively, moisture moving from the oceans because they're warm into a warmed atmosphere which can hold a lot more moisture. And then we wonder why these rains are coming and that flood everything out.
Yeah. Yeah, more energy in the atmosphere.
I was part of a team that wrote a little publication called, in 1963, entitled The Global Implications of Rising Carbon Dioxide Content in the Atmosphere. What we predicted was we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And that we could predict that we were about to create massive instability in all natural systems of the planet.
That was 1963.
1963.
Just want to put an exclamation point behind that.
That was now considered by global climate change people to be one of the very early bringing of the research that Roger Revelle and people like that did going back into the previous century.
Yeah.
But it brought it up to date into modern times to get the word out that we're headed for a crash. So all of this is to say human culture has shifted from the kind of sustainable, joyful life that I was describing into one where we get obsessively involved with increasing production, increasing population sizes, increasing greed and need, for maybe need and greed, for consumer items.
Yeah.
And we began to figure out ways to tap more and more of the Earth's reality, to pull in things like damming up water to create hydroelectric power,
Yeah.
figuring out ways to accumulate uranium so we could create radioactive energies and massive amounts of things like plutonium, which should never have been created on this planet. It does not belong here.
Mm-hmm.
And using those as new energy sources to feed the increasing consumption of energy. And now we have things like cryptocurrency that are producing massive demands on energy consumption again.
Yeah.
And so we're moving in a direction that, continue to move in a direction that looks on nature as a resource, as a basic thing to take from and use as a tool. So the indigenous peoples always look on nature as basically a family relationship. You don't treat your family as a resource to go out and take from. You're part of a natural group of beings that are working together, hopefully in relative harmony.
Mm-hmm.
Although we had a big family. When you put the direct kids and the cousins, we got cousins, brothers and sisters, grandparents,
Yeah.
and aunts and uncles lived together on one farm.
Yeah.
And it was quite a zoo.
Okay. I can imagine.
But it was a great opportunity to learn how to live in community.
How do we, this is, to me, this thread coming through, the recognition that our indigenous lifeways allow us so much more time for joyful living and very high quality of life. How do you approach the conversations with folks in places like Manhattan and inside the Beltway of DC who are themselves devoting 14, 16, 18-hour days of very deliberate and often very stressful work? And my experience is most of the folks working in that kind of context find themselves or believe themselves to be doing very important work. How do you provide the trailheads and the bridging and what's the solution? Recognizing, if in fact our modern culture is so out of balance, where do we go? What are the trailheads? What is the rhetoric of invitation?
What are the
Don't you have a more challenging and difficult question to ask?
Yeah. This is we're just starting off slow here.
Okay. Just sort of
Thanks,
checking
buddy.
on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, because this is, to me, this
Yeah.
is
Well, it's the
the
key.
question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the underlying issues there is, first of all, what makes people happy? What brings true happiness?
Yeah.
And including the Beltway inhabitants and the
Yeah.
Manhattan inhabitants.
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate to have lived in the middle of Manhattan and the Beltway.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that time. But both the residents of both of those cities, one for political power, one for finance predominantly, the people that make up that live there, they all have one underlying need to live a happy life,
Sure.
free of suffering as much as possible.
Yeah.
What they've been given is a life that is often filled with suffering, stress, anxiety, speed, a kind of life that's based on more and more consumer goods and consuming more and more. And that would provide the basic happiness. I'm sure you've probably all noticed that you can get that wonderful thing, that new car, that new whatever, new house, and you have some happiness for a short time. But then that happiness begins to vaporize as you begin to pay the taxes, take the car that's got this problem that you inherited with the car and you didn't know about. Now you've got to deal with it. And these things begin to build up and you begin to find more and more reasons to experience life as painful and difficult. Now that reality is true of all living things. They face that. When you live in a simpler kind of lifestyle, as most indigenous peoples do, simpler because you've turned over the responsibility for the management of life itself, to nature. You surrender to the inherent wisdom of Mother Gaia, Mother Earth, and all of life. And that fundamental wisdom of self-arising management takes care of in everything. I mean, every ecosystem involves species that have co-evolved with each other to create systems that support the ideal kind of system for that particular climate and geology and location. So these ecosystems, if we learn how to listen to what they offer, we can go into them and begin to create ways of relating to them in a modern context with modern technology that are in balance with that natural system. Mm-hmm. This is the way it's always been done, even with indigenous peoples. So what I found was helpful when I lived in both New York and D.C. was in both places I had places to go to. In D.C., for example, I bought a farm it's now up to 1,200 acres with some friends. And I dedicated that farm to being a place where people could come and let all the cares and concerns of their political lives in D.C. drop that for a little while and begin to connect to nature and themselves, their own inner nature, as well as the outer beautiful environment there. It was up on a place called Shenandoah Mountain. It's right in the middle of the Shenandoah Valley. I'm sure you've heard the beautiful song.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So Lost Hollow Farm.
Lost Hollow Farm. And so I'd bring people out there, friends and those that I had known, and give them a chance to taste how simple and easy a natural way of living could be.
Yeah.
I had a little organic farm going out there. And I didn't say this was the whole answer to the issues of all life, but people could begin to see it when they began to reconnect with nature and natural systems. These very important cares begin to fall away, and they began to be replaced by, wow, what a beautiful sunset. Look at the way the water is moving in that stream. Wow, it's so magical. All these spirals and whirls and bubbles. I can spend hours just meditating, enjoying the display of how that water is moving. Fantastic.
Yeah.
And all of this naturally provided by nature itself. And their cares began to melt away, and they found themselves experience just a natural joy of existence, of being. Kind of natural meditation. Hunters and fishermen accomplish that many times because they naturally fall into that kind of relationship. If you're a good fisherman or a good hunter, or in my dad's case, he was a friend of Jacques Cousteau, and we used to go out into the ocean with the early scuba equipment. Mm-hmm. And he was also a glider pilot and an airplane pilot, so we would go up in the air and glide or fly and learn how to connect to the currents of the air and appreciate in gliding, especially sailplaning, how you learn to spot the thermals of air moving up like this, and you can move the glider over to that thermal, just like an eagle would. Catch the thermal and let it carry you up high enough so it begins to vaporize, and then you naturally begin to glide down over the mountains until you see another thermal in the distance with a big thunderhead starting to form. You go for that just like all the eagles and the vultures are. You catch the thermal and you go up again, and you spend the whole day moving from thermal to thermal, riding the natural currents of the atmosphere. And by doing that, you learn to, again, appreciate the natural display and dance of life, and appreciate how the birds, the eagles, and the turkey vultures had mastered that thousands upon thousands of years earlier, and were experiencing kind of a joy of life that you were.
Yeah, beautiful.
So anything in nature can provide that. Sailing is another good example.
Yeah.
You can, simply by making that natural connection to natural systems, you begin to experience that inherent joy of life. And that's available to any city dweller as well. One other thing, I then began to spend some time. I began to become interested in what was it in the indigenous cultures that brought about that capacity to experience the natural joy of life. Well, one of the key things was something called the vision quest, where you would go out as a teenager and be alone in nature in a fairly powerful way that would tend to induce vision. And you'd be there for 3 or 4 days and nights. some cases a bit longer, and cry out for a vision of who you were. What is this lifetime for? What is this life? What's the meaning of life? And what is my role in this natural existence, a big family of living things? And very often you got the answer.
Mm-hmm.
You were given creative insight into what you're here for. In those tribes that had that maintained, there was virtually no juvenile delinquency.
Mm-hmm.
There was very little, and the cultures created ways of being in nature that were in harmony with nature. They had technologies, but the technologies, the part of the job of the culture was to find technologies that produced balance, harmony, and contributed to a kind of integrity in the system that was because it was a family relationship. You don't want to mess your family up and yourself. So the vision quest emerged as a very key element in what was being beneficial. So I began to, because I'd been doing vision quests since age 7, I would do at least one a year. Sometimes I'd do 2 or 3. I did my first month-long in the Olympic Mountains in Washington, in the Low Divide, between the Quinault and the Queets river systems. Probably you know those. Right in the very center of the Olympic Peninsula. And then later on I went on to do longer solos of up to 3 or 4 months at a time. And went deep. And then I began to study with different masters of cultures that had provided a way of deep connection to outer nature, inner nature, and true nature. See what were their principles and practices that allowed them to deep dive into connection. And I realized all of them had a way of connecting first to honoring the fact they were somewhat disconnected when they were first arrived. Then they began to learn the skills of how do you fundamentally connect. Then go a little deeper and have experiences of communion where you're at one with different beings of nature, but you also still have a certain kind of individuated self at the same time. That's called communion with the union. Then you go deeper into the community experience, begin having experiences of true unity with a tree, with an element, with the flow of water, with the beautiful display of the sky and the clouds. And you begin to have these experiences of being absolutely one with each being of nature, where there was no separation and no need for individuation because the you and the it had gone. And there was just one amazing happening that was filled with joy, bliss, and wisdom. And then from the experience of unity, when you do that with many different things surrounding you, you begin to have an experience of a natural mandala, or sacred circle arising. And then when you embrace that fully, you begin to realize that you're part of an amazing sacred unfoldment of a living system, like an ecosystem, but in a sacred way. And then when you go deeper with that, you realize that there's an opportunity or an invitation to follow the mandala or the individual connection at the level of unity back into the fundamental pure consciousness, pure awareness, pristine level of being that underlies the mandala and that whole connection sequence. And at that point, the whole experience becomes fully liberating and enlightening because it takes you directly back into source. So I began to see that as a template for a pathway that may be universal, that would allow people to experience a tremendous connection to nature while at the same time begin a path to enlightenment. And that became the way of nature.
Absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. Pretty simple.
Pretty simple. And speaking of enlightenment and thunderclouds, I want to ask you about lightning. But before getting there, I want to ask you just to describe for us specifically, just so folks know with the background here, the work you were able to accomplish in DC. And you know, obviously your work has helped preserve 1 million acres of wilderness in Alaska. You've helped to establish
130 million.
130 million.
Yes.
Well, that is a lot more than 1 million. Your work has helped to establish national parks around the world, preserve habitat for many species. And as I understand it, your work in DC helped to create NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act.
Yeah.
I don't know if I remember the acronym exactly right, but this led to Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, the creation of the EPA. Can you just summarize for us what happened at that time and what you were able to accomplish?
Well, I mentioned I was going back from this farm back first to D.C. So to help the shift I realized from my early vision quests that we needed a shift from a taker mentality to being part of the family of all living things. So to accomplish that, we needed to have a new kind of language and a new kind of concept of what was going on.
Yeah.
And as I began to search for a word that would bring this concept of being part of a big family in a neutral way, as I mentioned, we had those books like Rachel Carson's book on
Silent Spring.
Silent Spring, and then the book by Our Plundered Planet by that early pioneer.
Yep.
And
Osborne.
Fairfield Osborne.
Yep.
So I got together with a good friend of mine that I helped bring into the Conservation Foundation. His name was Frank Darling. He later was honored, became Sir Frank, honored by the English Queen. Anyway, we came up with the idea of using this word environment to be a replacement for resource. Resource is taker mentality. Environment is a natural system of which we are part. Totally different concept. And we did a gathering, a big conference, bringing in different individuals to present on how they viewed this environmental reality. And we used North America as an example in the beginning. And basically out of that came a book of quite a few chapters. I think it was probably at least 30 or so. And we explored how each expert in economics, in regional planning, in public policy, in biology, in these various disciplines that were said to have had the answer to how do we come back into balance. They came in and made their contributions to how their system of expertise could do that. And at the end of the gathering, we all realized none of those systems could do that alone. They had to work together in a context of a philosophical and experiential framework that was based on being part of natural systems, or part of the environment. So the word environment took on tremendous currency, because the leaders of all these different disciplines were there, and they saw that if they didn't bring them all together into one system, that was life connective. It was kind of a hopeless situation. It was just going to lead to more separation, more discontinuity, more rape and pillage, and no harmony at all with life. So at the end of that gathering, we produced a book called The Future Environments of North America, and that helped to brand the term environment solidly in 1965 as a foundational word to bring in that whole system perspective. And it kind of grew, it got on and grew and grew. Many people got involved. I was just one of those.
And we should really underscore the value of that distinction. I mean, that puts John right there with that lineage of Thoreau, Muir, Rachel Carson, to be able to offer to human beings a whole new perspective about what John was just saying, the environment.
So out of that came, much to our surprise, that word caught on and boom, suddenly there was an environmental movement. And looking back on it, it was just the right thing in the right way at the right time. Pretty simple.
Amazing. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So I think if we had any, if there was a magic, it was because it was exactly the right thing needed, exactly at the right time when the culture was ripe and ready to hear that message or that good news. And it was the right thing in the right way because we gathered all the top experts of the day. And so we had the right thing in the right way at the right time. And provided a catalytic transformative effect of birth to movement.
Yeah.
And then the movement took over. You had Earth Day and all kinds of stuff coming out of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and then we did some work I decided, well, this is great, but we need to have a truly global view here.
Yeah.
So I brought together with a friend of mine who was from Iran. His name was Mohammed Taghi Fafar, a true Islamic brilliant man.
Mm-hmm.
We worked with the Conservation Foundation, a group called the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems. And we basically put together a series of case studies using there's a school called, here it's not too bad, it's out in New England. Harvard.
Oh,
Harvard.
okay. Yeah.
Never heard of it.
Oh, my alma mater.
So
He likes to.
Yeah, maybe
Just
a little on that.
just a
That's
little.
good. That's good. You might deserve it. I don't know.
Yeah.
my mom's side of the family came from Cambridge, so
Okay.
there's a double twist here.
Yeah.
Fun.
Anyway, so we used the Harvard case study approach.
Mm-hmm.
Really good science.
Yeah.
We got 50 different scientists, and we did really a 4-year project to develop these case studies, and Taghi and I managed the case study development. So we were part of the research of each one of those. What turned out to be 200 case studies of what humans were doing to the planet on a global basis.
Mm-hmm.
And we pulled all those case studies together into one volume, got it published through Doubleday. But before the publication of that book, we had another big gathering of all those science leaders. And we had a big gathering which was focused on, okay, here's classical development for the rest of the planet based upon a taker mentality and a natural resource-based approach using conventional economics. Taker mentality, conventional economics. Here's the result. Here are the scientific proofs of what happens to natural systems and the total disequilibrium that is caused by things like the Aswan Dam, for example. And those 200 case studies were like an explosion in the development community. There was a big development community in the U.S. about creating projects around the world, going out and doing pre-investment surveys to initiate these new projects, and then moving on. So a lot of money was in the pre-investment survey to locate new places where you could use the taker mentality skillfully and blend them in with bilateral and multilateral aid programs through the World Bank.
Well, yeah, like our friend John Perkins wrote in Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Well, this is the source of all that.
Yeah, yeah.
So we went right to the root of all that. And the end result was these 200 case studies that proved the taker mentality does not work.
Yeah.
It leads to, especially to local catastrophe. It might feed a particular city or country in another place who takes those resources, but the imbalance created by that taker mentality was massive and was leading to the destruction of the planet in a wide variety of ways. And we documented all this using good, hard science.
Yeah.
And then we took those case studies and brought them to by that time the environmental movement was beginning to go global. We had produced the EPA as a result of the early
the
work.
Environmental Protection.
So I was part of that. We created the original concept for the EPA in an article in the Natural Resources Law Journal from New Mexico. We published in that the proposal for an EPA-like entity that would be responsible for what happens to the money you invest in a project using public money.
Yeah.
And we originally wanted to have an independent agency that would be responsible to review the impacts.
Yeah.
We lost on that one.
Yeah.
The lobbyists won. They made the agency that was doing the project responsible for the impacts. That doesn't work. Conflict of interest.
We've seen a lot of erosion of efficacy because of that, huh?
We still need to correct that and have an independent entity that does the review process. But anyway, I'm running.
Why was in brief, I'm sure this is a very big, potentially nuanced conversation, but why was Nixon politically motivated to sign that?
Well, I think, and of course Nixon came in, he was involved, he was an interesting man, a very complex guy, Capricorn. So he liked solid stuff, well organized stuff.
Good solid earth sign.
Yeah. We used to call him Tricky Dicky.
Right.
I can't say I was excited about working with him. I had worked in Johnson. You have to hand a lot of credit to Johnson and Kennedy.
Yeah.
For laying the foundation
so
for
much, right?
Yeah. So we accomplished a lot in the pre-Nixon era. But when Nixon came in, to his credit, he opened up a fairly decent relationship with China, and he was open to getting some of these fundamental laws passed. He did have a feeling for nature, and I think it was authentic. And this other side of him that led to the Watergate and all that crap, none of us knew about that side until that happened. But to his credit, he did do some very positive things for the earth at the same time.
Yeah.
When conservation and conservative were connected.
Right, like in the tradition of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
In those days, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party were both engaged in trying to help preserve nature. They were both in support of education, widespread human health, and supporting a good human health system, and supporting the environmental movement.
Yeah.
It was not bifurcated into a polarized thing like it is today.
Yeah.
And it was a sad thing when that happened.
Yeah.
But that's another story. The other thing I wanted, going back to the original theme, say is that when we went global with these case studies, and proved that this was creating a global massive impact, this became the evidentiary basis for something called the United Nations Conference on the Environment in 1972, which is the first major gathering to address the global issue of global environmental issues and change. And we were able to use this case study work as a very strong part of the evidence for what was happening on a global basis. And out of that came the establishment of UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, and the opening up of an environmental division within the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, and the OAS.
And that leads me to, maybe I'll just give a couple quick shout-outs. We did an interview with Hannah Strong, who lives not far from here, Manatee Foundation, and of course she and her husband Maurice were very involved in a lot of the UN environmental work for many years, and she's been very influential right here in this area in all kinds of ways.
John's on her board.
You're on her board.
Yeah, we basically work together with a small team of us that made all these gifts of land to different spiritual centers.
Yeah.
But that's a big whole nother story. Before I knew Hannah, I had been working with Maurice.
Okay.
Before he held the conference on the famous Stockholm conference that birthed the international environmental movement.
Yeah, beautiful.
And then he also was tagged to run the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit, which was called the Earth Summit under that umbrella, the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development.
Yeah.
That's what UNCED was. So it's all tied in.
Yeah.
And the origin was a lot of the work that John was doing.
It's so beautiful. I love the weaving of the web here. I want to give a shout out too to my good buddy Nick Chambers. We're right here on his chokecherry farm, and he's been on the podcast. Of course, got to give a shout out to Jenny Menke with Regenerative Earth, and she's been part of this conversation.
Yeah, she studied with John.
Right.
Yeah, Jenny's been senior student right there with Bud.
Yeah.
In fact, Jenny and I have co-guided some Sacred Passage programs in the Canyonlands together.
Oh, cool. I didn't know that. That's so cool. Yeah, Jenny's great. She's been on the podcast as well.
We're doing a lot of work together in Costa Rica.
Excellent. Yep. On the OSA probably.
Yep.
Very good. And I'll give a shout out to Brad Colland, who's off camera here, but also doing a lot of work with Way of Nature and the Sacred Land Sanctuary, and as program coordinator and senior guide. And got to also give a shout out to my sweetheart Caressa, who's off camera here, and she connected us with Elaine Blumenheim over at Joyful Journey Hot Springs. We had her on the podcast. That was wonderful, and Caressa and I enjoyed a nice soak yesterday when we got to the valley.
It's magic water.
It's what magic water, and I want to ask you about that. I want to take a quick moment to thank our many sponsors and partners who make the work that we're doing at the Y on Earth community possible. This is Visionary Leadership for Planetary Prosperity, including our podcast series. This includes Chelsea Green Publishing, Waylay Waters, Profitable Purpose Consulting, Earth Coast Productions, Patagonia, Dr. Bronner's, Josephine Porter Institute, EDAFIC Solutions, and of course, a huge thanks to our ambassadors, our growing global network of ambassadors, Bud, of course, being one of them, and many of our ambassadors make a monthly contribution to the work that we're doing to help fund and support this important ongoing effort. So a huge thanks to everybody. You can go to Patreon if you're interested in signing up as a monthly supporter. You can go to our website, wyonearth.org, and sign up at any level you like. If you choose the $33 or higher level here in the United States, we'll send you a monthly shipment of the Waylay Waters biodynamically grown hemp-infused aromatherapy salts as a thank you and as a way to help you in your personal well-being practices. And of course, our ambassadors have all kinds of additional resources, recordings of our workshops and seminars, our monthly meetup proceedings, and our behind-the-scenes segments with our podcast guests, which we'll be doing shortly with John and Bud. And if you're an ambassador, you have access to all of this and more. And it's a great and growing global community of leaders, organizational leaders, community leaders doing all manner of important environmental and social work. So we invite you to be a part of this if you are so called and if it resonates. And so, yeah, a huge thanks to all of our partners and our supporters. And I want to ask, we're going to talk about lightning. We're also going to talk about, I think for me, this might be the most difficult question of the discussion. Okay, we've seen the groundwork laid with the environmental protection legislation and agency, along with a whole number of other important institutions in our civic fabric, continually and deliberately eroded in the last several decades. And you mentioned the extreme polarity we're experiencing right now in our culture and our society. And you also mentioned energy demand from cryptocurrency, which, as I understand it, has been quickly eclipsed perhaps by energy demand coming from artificial intelligence now in the last few months. So we've got a very complex situation. It's been complex for some time, and one might even say it's becoming more and more so. I'm curious, from your perspective, recognizing that there are so many competing forces, many of which are cynical and Machiavellian, what the heck are we to do?
Well, come back into right relationship with nature.
How do we do that? And how do we get enough of us to do that such that the prevailing trends in society shift?
Well, the basic, remember I mentioned how fast the catalytic shift was.
Yeah.
The right thing in the right way at the right time to create the environmental movement.
Yeah.
I think we're at the same point right now where there's a basis for a major rebirthing of a new relationship to nature from a spiritual and experiential foundation.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a friend in Boulder, Russell McDougall, who came up with an acronym for Gaia.
Oh, yeah. I know
It's beautiful. It's global awareness is awakening.
Yeah, I love it.
And so from an awakened state of mindfulness and awareness, there is no alternative than to gather together in what another one of John's students and very capable and competent woman on her own part, Meg Wheatley likes to say, we are now clearly in collapse of the systems that have been so destructive and damaging. At the same time, they've uplifted the standard of our living profoundly, but we are spiraling down, and everybody feels it. We know it. You can sense it. It's in the energetic field. And so her recommendation is all solutions will arise from community. And the terminology she's been using is islands of sanity. And from her most recent book. And, with John's Cultivating Natural Liberation, teachings on reconnecting with the three natures, outer nature, inner nature, and our deepest true nature, combined with some of her work and many, many, many other people, you can see a huge proliferation of people focusing on regenerative activities, restorative, preservation movements and issues. So, and as Margaret Mead said, and John knew Margaret Mead, I met Margaret Mead when I was in my 20s, and basically it only takes a few individuals to gather together to change the world. And if you think that's an absurdly optimistic view that's not grounded in reality, look at history. There have been a few people in just the right time. Sometimes they didn't do just the right thing. Often they did horrible things, but it was only a few people. And then it cycles out into the broader and broader culture and reaches more and more people through demonstrating a much more attractive, much more compelling, and much more balanced and grounded way of being through demonstration. I mean, that was Bucky Fuller's contribution to all of us. If you're not happy with what is happening now, get busy and create something that's more attractive, more compelling, and more solution-oriented. It's all about design.
Yeah, love it. This all resonates very much with our forthcoming book. We actually have a Bucky Fuller quote along with a couple others at the beginning there, speaking about the islands of sanity as well. And hopefully we can connect with Meg and collaborate with her a bit as well. And I think what I'd like to do is invite a conversation about the lightning and about the Kogi people. And I know those aren't necessarily directly and obviously connected, but I'm sure you can weave those threads brilliantly.
Yeah, what would you like to know?
Tell us about your experience with the lightning.
Well, part of the next step that I was mentioning earlier that is up for us is if you look at what has caused true deep transformation around the planet over time, Meg has done a great job of looking at how cultures have fallen apart. I've taken, and we've worked together on some really nice joint work where we bring together some of her background with Shambhala training and the work we've developed in Way of Nature for deep connection to nature training, or the three natures. But part of her skillfulness was doing a review of all those cultures that have fallen apart, most of which have fallen apart, and done a review of the masters that have gone in and seen the patterns of how cultures and things fall apart.
Yeah.
I've been interested in the other side of the question too. How do cultures come together to support a movement for transformation in a positive way? Or what are the things that have actually brought about the initiation of a brand new cultural system? And we're planning to create a new program called the Champions Program that is going to be based on this. What are these cultural foundations for positive transformation? Now, I should also mention these patterns have not always been positive. If you look at the history of cultural formation processes. But what I can say is that the keys for that have often boiled down to either religious and spiritual, or in some cases political, economic causes. Communism being an example of that, the latter. But many, I would say maybe the majority of global transformation, transformative movements have had a spiritual foundation, be it Muhammad or Christ or the Buddha, and so on. Each of them led to the creation of unbelievable transformation on the human cultural level. I think we're at one of those times. So what I've done is to try to provide a foundation of core principles for liberation. We have 12 principles of natural liberation, which are part of the key of our process. And then another part is, you mentioned the 6 natural powers that are necessary to come together in order to provide a truly transformative event for any individual who wants to engage in this kind of transformation and liberation. So the root of all that work for myself came from becoming deeply embedded in several different traditions and lineages that had benefited and been part of cultural transformation in powerful ways. One of the early ones was the Taoist internal alchemy system. In that system, it was really the shamanic systems of Tibet brought together, or of China brought together. And it's all based on how the energy patterns are developed and managed and worked with. For example, our understanding of the meridian flow in the body, the channels and the vessels, are all based out of the investigations of these Taoist masters from long ago. They also developed ways of working with sound and light and the environment, natural systems, to support these kinds of powerful transformation. So I've been lucky to study with those systems going back to really to the 60s, and especially focusing on Qigong and Tai Chi. So I began to incorporate some of that into what I was offering some of the folks that began to engage in these Vision Quest-like experiences, or a contemporary type of Vision Quest. But this was part of the preparatory work to do that. And then I went deep into Hindu systems of Tantra. And not just the sexual Tantra, but the Tantra in the sense of the investigation of how all of consciousness and all the forms that manifest from that fundamental consciousness are woven together in a great web, sort of the Indus web type of thing, where all forms arise from this state, are completely interconnected in a natural matrix, unlike the artificial matrix of the movie. This is the natural matrix in which we are all embedded. And Hindu Tantra was superb in investigating the natural matrix of the Divine Mother especially. So I went deep into the teachings of Kali and Durga and Bhagavad and you might say the sacred feminine, and spent close to a decade going deep into those systems in the Himalayas with my teachers. Another one was the fundamental teachings of Tibet. I worked in the Himalayas for many years and began to help many of the refugees coming out of Tibet find work. They had no money and no source of support, so I would hire them in doing these surveys that led to new national parks in places like Sagamata and Meridaris, in other words, Sagamata, the original name. Chitwan, and in a Purna sanctuary area, Dhaulagiri, and so on.
And you worked directly with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, yeah?
Yes, I was his bodyguard for a while.
Oh my gosh, no kidding.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Yeah.
The stories continue.
Well, that was...
You were his bodyguard for a while.
He had just won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, so they were afraid that he was going to be killed. And so they brought me in as a bodyguard because of my martial arts background.
Did you pack heat?
I pack chi.
That's heat.
Yeah, pack chi. It can be hot or cold.
Cool. Very cool.
So it's almost always grounded. So went deep into some of the Tibetan systems. Was lucky enough to study with some really great masters like Dodo Khyentse Rinpoche. And
just for those that don't know, Dodo Khyentse Rinpoche was the Dalai Lama's root guru teacher.
considered to be a fully enlightened master.
And John took me there on our journey to the ashram where John hung out with Dodo Khyentse.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets deeper and deeper the more you reveal.
It's hard to get into all this in a short time, but
Yeah,
anyway.
the extraordinary journey that John has been on and that he's taken me on for 30 years as well, off and on. So,
And one of the things Dogo was a master of was something called Dzogchen, which is basically the way of deep immersion in Source, and Rigpa, which is fundamentally the pristine primordial awareness that is the foundational state of Source itself.
Like the Akash in the Vedic system.
So in the Hindu system, it would be somewhat akin to the, if you think about Shiva and Shakti and their coming together as that fundamental duality of being, Shiva representing pure consciousness, Shakti pure energy. This is like the underlying state that supports both. It's prior to anything in the world form, be it in a spiritual form or a physical form. So Dzogchen is one of the master pathways to that. So I've studied deeply in Dzogchen for a long time, and we've honored that and benefited from that, I would say, in the unfoldment of our common ground approach. And then, of course, many shamanic systems have been tremendously helpful to me. I taught a strange guy called Carlos Castaneda back in the 70s. He would come to my trainings in Mexico City. But that's a whole other story.
That's a whole other story.
But he's an example
We'll dive into that on the behind-the-scenes segment for our ambassadors. Well,
here's a guy who came in from blended Yaqui and Toltec wisdom into a contemporary context for opening up the second attention and beginning to see how we can shift from consensual reality fixation into a non-ordinary reality experience. And those techniques are very helpful. We use them all the time, Brad and I.
Yeah.
So
his literature I remember reading as a relatively young man for me was psychotropic, entheogenic. It had that effect.
Yes. Most of these systems, by the way, including Castaneda's and Don Juan's system, are free of the need to depend upon plant substances. Most of what we do has no need for any kind of plant medicine. It's so powerful, it doesn't need that. And even in the Castaneda Don Juan tradition, the plant substances were used as allies in the very beginning of the path. If you are too fixated on consensus realities being how things are, and you need to get shaken out of that a little bit, then those plant substances, be it datura or peyote or other systems, were brought in for a short while. So you'd loosen up your attachment to the fixation on consensual reality is real, and you begin to shift into the realization there are many other reality formation possibilities. And then you're ready to receive the fundamental teachings that constantly allow you to go back into the fundamental source, because another reality formation can be just as much a source of attachment and aversion as this consensual one we all participate in for the most part now.
Yeah, and so in our culture there's a dependency issue of thinking, we've got to have something from the outside that's going to...
Yeah, fixation on any particular reality formation process is going to be antithetical to freedom and liberation.
Truly.
So anyway, long story short, through all these years of being a student of these different systems, I began to see the common ground that they had. And I was able to distill those common ground principles and processes into what is now the way of nature training process. And the Way of Nature training process involves first 3 or 4 days in a sacred passage of a deep and becoming embedded in these processes and principles. Then a period of going out into nature and dropping all connection to the outside world and other humans in a very protected space. We usually do it in a very sacred space. So we have the benefits of a sacred place in nature and the power of solitude, which come into play and support this. And if you've never dropped out of being in human culture for a week, here's your chance. And you're encouraged to leave behind all the normal appurtenances of being part of your culture and be open and rest in the stillness of the body, the inherent quietude of the normally busy mind, and the immense spaciousness of Source as your foundational state. And in that stillness and silence and space, you can open into a very profoundly deep level of connection to Source and a deep, deep connection to the big family of all living things.
And I'm Exhibit A.
Bud is Exhibit A.
For the truth of what John is speaking.
We'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, right.
So,
But it is, I mean, what John just described is absolutely a profound experience that might answer one of your other questions. How do we get into this transformation?
But then, once you've been through those first 2 steps, then there's the emergence from that into coming back into this consensual world with the
Service, purpose, mission.
the bills, the media, Facebook, or Twitter. Or is it X now?
What they're saying.
What are they saying? All the stuff of this modern life.
Yeah.
And how do you integrate what's happened skillfully so that you can maintain being able to be in this world and to be skillful and functional in this world? So I've created a process of reintegration and sharing, or I should say sharing and reintegration, because we will share together what's happened as a group. And then the process of integration involves what I call tempering. But it wasn't around
for some of those trainings.
Yeah. This is a new thing that we've been doing more recently. And so now a lot of the emphasis is on tempering, means like when you temper a sword, it goes into the fire, comes out into it gets hammered a little bit to get a good cutting edge.
For 30 years.
Then into the water, then back out, back into the fire. Do that 1,000 times.
Yeah. Then you're strong.
Then you have an amazing sword. You can cut tissue paper floating in there.
Yeah.
So this is what we do with the tempering process. We don't have the time to go into the detail of how we do it, but let me just say that's at the heart of our reentry. And so those 3 stages, first stage of the training, then the solitary time, or the all-one time as we call it. We redefined alone to all-one. And then the time of integration and tempering and sharing. So the totality of that, it's quite powerful. We probably put one of them even more stress now on the last stage, because that's often the most challenging part of the whole process. But those 3 stages together comprise the Way of Nature process.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
And that can be done in a very short program we call the Way Sharers program, which it can be as short as an afternoon, like in the Pachamama Alliance. Remember we went over that facilitation that had a film?
For which one?
Pachamama.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
And they have a nice film and an introduction process. Very essentialized. So we've been developing that stage for a beginner's program. Super, just beginning, opening the door. And then we have a renewal program that goes more deeply into actually the actualization of the process in a 1 or 2 day event. And then a deeper level, which is called a nature quest, where you might have several days of training, maybe 3 in total, and then several days of going into solitude and nature and camping. Whereas the prior one, the renewal program, you don't have to camp. You could just do the entire process during the day and work out of a normal retreat
Beautiful.
center or hotel even. And then the final stage for the normal program process is a sacred passage where you have 3 or 4 days of training at the beginning, then a period of deep solitude in the way I described, and then the integration process is the third stage.
Beautiful.
And that became the foundation for a new MIT program for leadership
Okay.
that's called Theory U.
Here you, the Presencing Institute.
And Otto Scharmer picked up on this really skillfully, and Brian Arthur helped bring he did 50 passages and distilled the process that I just described into something that could be the foundation for leadership training.
Cool.
And then Otto Scharmer, and Peter Senge, and Joseph Jaworski brought this together and said, wow, this is pure magic, pure gold. And they brought that all together in a book called Presence. And we worked together, Way of Nature and those three to produce early this book called Presence, along with Betty Sue Flowers, which gives a good documentation of this process in a way that people can easily understand. Especially, there's a chapter by Jaworski on opening the heart. I think, was it chapter 8, Brad? I think it's chapter 8.
Which book is this?
Presence.
Presence. Cool.
Yeah.
If you don't know Jaworski, you should. He did an early book called Synchronicity, a second book, which was this book on presence that he did collaboratively with Scharmer and Senge and Betty Sue Flowers. And then he did a more recent book that we worked together quite a bit on, called Source. And that came out more recently.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I am so grateful for this opportunity to visit. Of course, I want to mention, this will be in the show notes as well, folks can go to wayofnature.com to find all of the ways of connecting in and experiencing the immersive experiences and getting to the books and research. You're about to say something?
Oh, I was just going to mention that I was going to add on at the very end, the lightning aspect.
Please.
But whenever you're ready for that.
That was great. That was always great for lightning.
We don't have enough clouds in the sky quite today yet.
We can summon them or something, right?
Yeah.
Invite them over.
Yeah, be careful what you ask for.
Our biodynamic friends around the world tend to bring in thunderclouds like that with ceremony. Yeah.
I probably shouldn't talk about the Starwood visit that we had.
We'll save that for the
Yeah.
behind the scenes
Okay.
segment.
I'm not sure I remember that. What was that? Sorry.
Behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes.
We're also going to talk about a giant serpent behind the scenes, I understand.
Oh yeah.
So
Good.
we'll save that for a minute too.
So as I mentioned, the whole Way of Nature is a number of trinities. One of them is outer nature, inner nature, true nature.
Yeah.
Right? Well, true nature or source nature is probably that, if one is fully accomplished in that, it's one thing to have a taste. It's another thing to stabilize that a bit. It's a third thing to be fully established that, and no matter what's going on, it's a flowing from that. And so in order to be able to share well at that level, it was pretty important for me to go through a number of experiences that helped support authentic connection. And for me, one of the biggest ones, along with people like Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who was permanently established in that, and just being around that, being the field of source was so omnipresent that if you had any kind of openness and capacity to relax and listen, it was right there. And all you had to do was surrender into that, and be open to that, and receive the blessing of Source itself. It's the power of transmission. Very simple, very direct. Only available to those who really listen and really let go. But in the meantime, I was helping a guy. We had we published a national newspaper called the Green Earth News. It was a good news newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
One issue only. I did this with a couple of friends back east near the Shwangunk Mountains, which is where the Kittinis from New Jersey go up into New York State, near the Catskills. And we published this one issue, and I was working on that paper, did a couple of articles for it. And one of the guys who helped support that paper, or fund it, it's kind of an experiment to seed a good news newspaper only in the culture. Nice idea.
Cool. Very cool.
And so I was honored to be asked to be part of the editorial group to do that. This one guy that was a major financial supporter had a 1,000-acre property, or 1,000+ acre property that he felt was very sacred, and he felt, because of my background, that I'd be perfect to do a dedication ceremony for this site. So in a way, that was a seed source for what we now have here in the Sacred Land Sanctuary, which is, as far as I know, is the first major modern cultural setting aside of land as inherently sacred, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but this is a very early precursor to that in 1984, which is a very interesting year, if you know anything about the book 1984. Anyway, so I did the ceremony. It felt very powerful. It felt like it was just the right time for this. I went back home to get a bit of rest. And I was preparing for sleep. And I like to often read and do things before bed, so I tend to go to sleep later, like 11 or 12. And I was just getting ready to kind of start my process of going to bed and having a little quiet time before that. And suddenly, out of a clear blue sky, a lightning bolt came through an open window in the bedroom, hit me. Killed me, because I was taken out of the body. And I was immediately catapulted into a tunnel with a big, huge, like being inside of a tornado. You think of the Wizard of Oz and the tornado in the movie there, where everything went up. It's kind of like that, but jet black. And the sound of thunder, like the entire universe was being ripped apart. The thunder was very impressive. And then I shot headfirst through the tunnel. At the end of the tunnel was an exit that it was brilliantly light, just absolutely brilliant light. So I shot headfirst through the tunnel with the thunder directly into this light. And when I entered the light, the body dissolved, everything dissolved, all form dissolved. All that was left was pure, clear, spacious vastness, openness, and absolutely clear light, the foundational state. And I had noticed more or less what time it was before I went to bed. It was around just before midnight. And then I was brought back through the tunnel feet first this time, and back into a body. I assume it was mine. I'm not sure. But there was a body on top of the bed in a cross-legged position, in a meditation posture, like a Buddha posture. And put back into this body, and then the walls of the tunnel dissolved, but I was still looking at the light that I'd come out of. And as the walls of the tunnel dissolved, I saw that that was the planet Venus, or the morning star. And it was 6 in the morning, 6 hours later. And
that's the blazing star. That's the pentalpha energy.
I don't know if you know anything about Quetzalcoatl.
A little bit.
But Quetzalcoatl was considered the son of the morning star. And he was kind of a Buddha for this hemisphere.
There's a connection with the Christ, too, because Venus goes away 40 days at a time. Right? There's a whole thing there. And the geometry, Earth, the Venus, and Sun forms is the pentalpha flower.
Yep, exactly. A lot of things that are interesting. And the Buddha himself was awakened when he had that first sight of the morning star.
What a fabulous experience.
That was the moment of enlightenment for him.
Golly, what'd you have for breakfast the next day? What'd you have for breakfast after that?
Don't remember.
That's incredible, John. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us.
And didn't you also hear a question? There were only 2 questions. What did you learn, and how well did you love?
That's
Was that a later experience?
that's a question that comes up for many people after they die,
Right.
and it's like a fundamental question of what were the benefits and the great teachings of this existence you just took on, and it's kind of a common ground 2 questions.
Yeah.
In this case, it wasn't about that.
No, that's a different.
It's pure initiation.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we have a lot more to talk about, and I look forward to doing so. And when I have 4 pages of notes filled up, that's one cue I get that it's time to wrap up
Enough
a
is enough.
episode.
Enough
So
is
what
enough.
we're gonna do is we're gonna wrap up the podcast, and I want to thank you for taking the time to visit. I'm so happy we're having this conversation. I look forward to what will come as well. And Bud, of course, thanks to you for putting all of this together and for all of your beautiful work and contributions to the Y on Earth community in particular. And before we sign off, what I'd like to do is give each of you the floor for any final message you might like to share with our audience, and more haiku than epic poem, if you catch my drift here. And Bud, I'll start with you. Put you on the spot first. And thank you both for this wonderful conversation.
Yeah, sure. Well, I really don't know that I have anything particularly pithy or poignant to add, because this is the depth of all of this that we've been exploring is as good as it gets. I'm just extremely grateful for being a connector. It seems to be one of the roles that I play. I sometimes tease and say I'm Forrest Gump's cousin, or because I end up being surrounded by extraordinary people, and I wonder, what am I doing in this picture now? Why am I showing up here in this moment? But I think that the journey is so worth the effort. And what John was speaking to in terms of listening, there's such magic in silence and presence. It really is the portal that opens to an open, radiant heart and a connection with a capacity for tremendous compassion. And it's not as difficult as we make it seem, or as intimidating, and yet it does really require intention and perseverance and commitment. So I think that's another part of the gift of being a student for these decades now with John, and having people like Brad and others that are totally devoted and dedicated to this kind of immersion in nature and immersion with a trajectory towards embracing Source, allowing and accepting Source to be our guiding bright star. That, I just encourage people to have the courage to step into this kind of journey. Yeah, and there's so much more still.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bud.
Sure, you're welcome. My pleasure. Okay, what's next? Look into the vast spaciousness of your mind. There's no separation.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Mind, heart, I should say.
Yeah. Well, and John?
Oh, yeah.
The floor is yours.
Well, I think it pretty well laid out what I had to say, but I would like to re-mention that most of the truly transformative aspects that led to a cultural transformation had a spiritual, sometimes economic or political basis. And I do feel like this process we've been sharing about today has many of the seeds of that potential. And it is available at a very beginner's level, super beginner's level, intermediate, and much more advanced, depending on where you're coming from, where you're ready to go. And feel honored that I'm able to be part of that, helping this little catalytic seed be brought forth in this time, similar to what happened in the 60s with planting that seed of natural systems being the mother of the big family that we're part of. I think it's a similar moment, but this time it's a spiritual foundation. It's common ground based that can be offered to human culture as a way to come back in balance and right relationship with all of life and Mother Earth.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you both. Thank you, everybody. Bye for now.
The Y on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit yonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code YONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the yonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Y on Earth community.